So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for our Livestock Advisor Update webinar, Getting the Most Out of My Feedback. So a bit of housekeeping first of all. We'll take questions at the end of the webinar. So if you could please add them all into the chat throughout the webinar, that would be great. And if you could keep yourself muted during the presentation, that would be really helpful as well. So my name is Keely Kovacevic, and I'm the Project Manager for Adoption and Capability Building at Meat and Livestock Australia. And today I've got the pleasure of introducing our speaker. So Will Atkinson is the MSA Business Development Officer here at MLA. Too many acronyms, that's our problem.
Yes.
Will grew up on a beef property in New South Wales, and he studied ag science at Charles Sturt Uni. He has now been working with MLA for the last 5 years. Actually, this is his 6th year. And he spends his time in and out of processing facilities, working with the red meat businesses to help them improve their quality and better utilise the products on hand, including running workshops with their trade partners, both domestically and internationally, and directly supporting their supply chain around carcass feedback and how to better utilise the feedback for on-farm change. And a huge part of that is this myFeedback piece of work. So Will's here today to talk to us about myFeedback and how advisors can best use myFeedback to help their clients and to help them grow their business. So Will, over to you.
Cheers. Thank you, Keely. Welcome, everyone. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and we'll get into it. So what I'm going to cover off on today is just go through a bit around the myFeedback platform and actually provide you guys a bit of an overview and be able to actually understand what is on offer in that system and what's on offer for your producers as well. So first of all, though, what we're going to do is just cover off on a brief overview of what the MSA program is, or Meat Standards Australia. And the reason for that is because there's a large component of the carcass data that actually comes through during the grading that is feeding into myFeedback. So it's an important component. And then what I'll do is I'll just briefly touch on what actually is myFeedback and what it does, and then I'll go into that demonstration for you there. So first of all, MSA is an eating quality grading program that was designed to ensure consumer satisfaction of Australian red meat. And so we have asked consumers to rate product on a number of traits: tenderness, juiciness, flavour, and overall liking. And that has actually been conducted around the world. So this consumer sensory, which I'll get into a little bit of detail about in a second, but we've done those across 13 different countries. There's been over 180,000 consumers involved in that. And that gives us a huge database of 1.2 million samples of beef and 400,000 samples of sheep meat. And this is across 12 different cooking methods, so not just your traditional cooking methods like grill and roast. So what that looks like is we actually understand that animal side of it, the carcass traits, what goes on farm, some measurables around that there. And then we get the consumers to eat the product and they rate that product on those 4 traits I mentioned. And that allows us to actually get an eating quality outcome and to understand what the consumer wants out of that product. And so that's really important to then help provide feedback down the chain on how you actually influence the quality that the consumer is going to enjoy based on those carcass traits. So what we've been able to do is we've been able to identify that across the consumer quality, across all the cuts within the carcass, and across those 12 different cooking methods that I briefly mentioned before. And as you can see, it fits a number of different cooking styles, so not just your traditional, but into more of the Asian style cooking. Of course, because we export so much product there, it's important to understand the impact of quality there. And then that gives us the indication of then what these carcass traits actually impact quality. So when we've done all that consumer research on the cut and the cooking method, we then can relate it back to the actual individual traits that the producers can influence and that we measure during that grading process. So you can see here there's a number of different factors that are measured during grading, and we include all this data as part of the MSA grading carcass data that then is feeding into myFeedback as well, which I'll touch on. And so all of this information and all of these carcass traits that are measured and the cut individual primal with the cooking method leads us to the MSA index. So the key thing about the MSA index is it is a benchmarking tool for producers. So this enables the producer to understand the overall quality of their carcasses, and it helps them identify where they are in relation to not only within their own herd, but also in relation to state, national, and region. And it gives them the ability to identify what they need to do and what changes they can make that influence the quality of the carcass. So that's a quick overview of MSA, just to give you the background before we go into the myFeedback side of things. So the beauty about myFeedback is it's designed to be a one-stop shop for all your information and all the carcass traits and data. So it provides us the insights into all those different traits, such as MSA data, then gives access to the NLRS and the NLIS data, as well as then your animal health, disease and defect data. And we'll be working on that more closely with processors to help them actually measure and report on the disease and defect more accurately and provide that information as feedback for producers as well, enabling them to understand what is the impact of those instances of disease and defect within the carcasses, and then on performance as well as quality there. The idea about another great thing about myFeedback is it gives us the opportunity to actually benchmark not only ourselves, our herd, but within the region, state, and nationally across those factors that I mentioned. You see in the first dot point there. It's not just the MSA data, but also that other NLIS and the Animal Health Australia data that's feeding into it. And of course, the beauty about the system, it's actually available across the whole supply chain. So producers, both beef and sheep producers, as well as processors, and then your brand owners in amongst that there can have access to the system at varying levels. So just on myFeedback uptake as of recently, so it is a new system. It was launched in November last year. And since then, we've got 19 beef and sheep processors on board providing data into the system. Some of that data may just be the MSA, might just be NLIS, and it might some of it might include all of the above and the animal health and disease and defect data. But from that, that's enabled currently 961 producers to access that data. And you can see the trend there, obviously trending up quite well there. So that's just a quick overview of the MSA program, and then the touching on the myFeedback. So what I'm going to do now is actually just go into myFeedback, talk through some of the features that's available to you, and we'll step through that and the different reporting on offer. So just quickly change to that. So when you first log into myFeedback, what you'll see here is this consignment summary. So you'll be able to click on and see in this case, it's across, should actually say, sorry. In this case, it's across these dates here. So basically the last year, but you can adjust these dates in any way that you would like. And you can work with your producers to navigate through this as well. So what this gives us is information on if you've had multiple processors that you can sign cattle to, in this case cattle, and then if you've got multiple picks that you own and working across, or you're working with your producers across. And then it gives us a quick overview, and it is exactly that. It is just an overview and a summary. And you can tell here that we had over that year, nearly 30,000 head go through the program, a small portion of female, majority being male, but then gives you quick information on carcass traits such as weight, pH, fat depth, and then of course the MSA index, which I touched on before. What's good about this here is you can actually then see, well, in terms of the national benchmark, how does that compare? You got that 290 versus 370. Same then with your P8 fat and your MSA index. You can see the national there is over that time frame. The national was 59.33, but in this consignment or this group, sorry, there's over a 62.9. And then down here, you then have the option to actually then look into each individual consignment, go through each of those dates, what the average traits were So yield here as well, index, and then of course compliance to MSA, which I'll touch on. And then I'll go into more detail about the disease and defect as well. But you get a quick snapshot of those consignments. You also have a similar framework in the sheep. However, there's on a smaller scale. So it's obviously mob based. So you've got data across a mob and lot based as opposed to individual bodies there. What you can see here is similar sort of thing. You can see your total head, obviously the carcass weight that you got there, and then the fat score that came out of that compared to the national there. Beauty about this is you can actually change both in the cattle and the sheep. You can change whether you want to go to state or regional. So you can sort of dial that into your region to understand how you actually are comparing within that region and more directly associated to your neighbours. And of course, the same in terms of the consignment summary, where you've got these individual consignments that you can go in and get more information about. Back to the cattle side of things, then going into what we can go into from there is this reporting on animal disease and defect. So this is a relatively new space for us and for industry. So obviously the processors have to measure and ultimately for a food safety and risk to the consumer, we have to measure instances of disease and defect. However, there's not been a one spot where you can access all that data from the processors, and there's also the ability for that processor to measure that to a specific standard. So then around the country, it's actually the data is standardized, and if you consign somewhere in New South Wales and consign somewhere then in Victoria, then you're going to access the same data measured the same way. However, it is a new space for us, so we're actually currently working with industry to get on board with this. Some processors, as you can tell here, some processors are releasing that data and reporting to the standard, but we're working quite closely with the others to ensure that they're able to measure that going forward for industry to utilise. So what you have here in the quick summary of the disease and defect report. So in this case, the date range here is just selected a different date range. What you can then see from that is you've got the number of head that were inspected over that total time frame, and then actually then the number of head that had conditions during that time frame as well. Obviously then spits that out into a percentage there, showing sort of the numbers in your herd that are diseased or healthy in that that time of measurement. Over the right-hand side here, you can see that there's then the instances of those diseases, so how many of the head had those various diseases, and then also, of course, the percentage of the total. If you're wanting to know a bit more information, you can click on the more information link there, and for example with hydatids, it then takes you to the MLA Solutions to Feedback portal, which gives you all the information that you need to understand a bit more about the disease, causes and clinical signs, etc., that you can look into. And so this might help if you're working across different producers within that region. And obviously if it's region, it can be region specific where there's higher instances of some of those diseases. So it gives you an understanding of how you might be able to work with your producers to ultimately reduce that instances and understand the impact to them and to their business further. This just gives us a bit of an overview more in a table side of things, and that then gives you an understanding of sort of the instances of those diseases. But as we start going down, you can see these conditions over time. So then you can start looking at a date range and you might be able to get a seasonality understanding of how this occurs. And that gives you the opportunity to identify it across national, state, region, and then of course your data's in there as well. And this will be specific to the producer. You can access through to identify and work with your producer to understand the data further. In this case, we just had fluke showing, but you can change those to the other diseases across the board that we measure here. And then you can tell the date range across the bottom there. So going forward, that's the animal disease and defect information that's on offer in myFeedback. Again, very new platform. We're open to any suggestions and feedback on that, and we'll constantly be working to update that to best suit industry. And as we work with industry closer, we'll be able to start having more consolidated data around the whole country that allows us to identify those impacts to disease and defect across the board. What I'm going to jump into now is just the MSA summary. So more into then the other component of it, which is your MSA grading and the carcass data, which has been drawn in from the MyMSA system. So if your producers are consigning cattle to the processors directly and they get grading data, they're able to access this information and see that there. Another neat feature of the myFeedback is we will be providing a level of access to a breeder based on that original pick on the NIS tag. And that enables the breeder to actually identify, well, what are some of those carcass traits coming out of my cattle further. So it gives you guys an opportunity to actually work more directly with some of those breeders that you might work with and help them better understand with those genetic decisions that they're making on farm. Are they actually getting the outcome in the carcass and getting the outcome that they would expect to, and helps just align that supply chain a bit more directly. Same things in the same setup as the animal disease and defect. You can see here that it gives you a quick overview of the total head consigned for MSA grading. And then of that, the non-compliance there as well. This is a very low non-compliance. And that MSA compliance is based on pH and rib fat. We can go into any more detail as needed if you would like at later date. On the right-hand side here, you can see the traits that measure during grading, your low scores, your high scores, and then your average. Gives you a bit of an indication of how that herd is performing. But of course, you can select across different processes and change the date range as needed. This just identifies the reasons for compliance. So you can see here that number 4, or pH, is the reason for most of your non-compliance here, and that just gives you the instance of compliance there, plus a couple of other things in here like your fat depth and fat distribution. Same thing as a disease and defect. It gives you the opportunity to actually benchmark against industry. So in this case, it's nationally, but you have the ability to do it region and state as well. And then, of course, not just the MSA index, but it'll also give you the opportunity to look at the other traits in more detail. But looking at this, across that date range, the national had about 1 million head graded. And in this portfolio, there's 49,000 head that were graded. And you can start to see from an MSA index point of view where the average top 5 and bottom 5% fit versus, in this case, national. And that gives you, obviously, the visualization behind that there. So this gives you an opportunity to work with your producers to help them understand where they fit in relation to the state, region, or national, and also that variation or the distribution in the MSA index. And that's quite important for ensuring consistency in product. If you've got huge range, the same as the benchmark, there's risk to the consumer of a wide range of product going through. So helping keep that quality tight, nice and tight, then gives you consistent product going into the processor, and then allows you to have then more high performers at a consistent level for the consumer as well. And this just gives you the distribution, but you can change that by different groups. So say, for example, if you wanted to look at whether you've HGP status or not in relation to a grain feeding scenario, you can actually then identify where they compare in impact to quality. And this is specific MSA index in this case, but of course the marbling, carcass weight, ossification, those other scores have a component there as well. And then of course the traits over time. So it gives you quick information about how that performance is changing over time. And you can sort of see here there's a bit of fluctuation, but it's not huge difference between the top and bottom. But it gives you an idea of where there might be seasonal fluctuation occurring, or was there a spike where, well, a dip, I guess, in terms of quality, and you might be able to work with them to identify, well, what caused that dip in quality, or why are these performers doing so well, and start sort of tracing back through the supply chain a bit further. So the next feature within myFeedback is actually this combined reporting. So what we have there is the ability to then combine the impact that the instances of disease and defect have on the performance of those carcasses and the performance of those animals. And so this gives you a really good understanding of where, if there's underlying diseases that haven't been identified on farm but picked up during the offal detection, an understanding of whether that impact has actually had, whether that disease has had an impact on performance, and looking into where you can help control to improve performance around that. So this just gives you quick information around that. So you've got whether they so when I say none here, just to quickly touch on that, it's whether we've got a feed type or different dentition. So the none here is just we haven't separated for different groups. But it shows the ossification scores by abscess, fluke, hydatids, nephritis, pneumonia, and then of course the healthy group. You can start to see where that changes. Obviously, this is can be specific to region where the disease might have a high instance due to that region, and the impacts will vary across supply chains. And that then ultimately gives you the opportunity to work with your producers to identify where that impact is occurring. Same thing as before. If you want to know more information, you can. Quick summary table of the traits and the impact of those diseased and undiseased. And then down in here, it actually gives you a correlation between where the MSA index sits and ossification, and then the impact of those diseases. And you can actually see in most cases that there is lower MSA index scores in this group of animals because of instances of diseases, and that is expected. So what I'm going to step into now is actually around the grid specifications. So another key feature of myFeedback enables producers and yourself to set out a grid spec. So this gives you the opportunity, if you've got multiple grids to multiple different processes, or your producers have multiple grids, you can actually access and look into those to understand what's going, understand what the grid is and how you might work to achieve the most optimal point within that grid. Just to clarify with this one, it's actually not the processor submitting it. It is you creating that grid, or the producer creating that grid based on what the buyer might have provided or an agent might have provided. So for a quick example, you can go in and you can just chuck in a quick example on cattle. You can go in and just chuck in things around your P8 fat ranges, your carcass weight ranges, and then put in some dollar values around that product as well. And then from there, there's actually the ability to check compliance to that grid and lost opportunity based on being non-compliant, say too high or too low in terms of carcass weight. And you can add in different penalties or premiums. In this case, it's quite a basic grid, but what you can do then going forward, you can actually then select a, select into a different grid or create your own grid that might be a bit more detailed if there's some other signals coming through, like an MSA index score. So you can see here, for example, I've built the grid out with index, MSA index, P8 fat, and hot standard carcass weight. And you can see where those values sit in relation. There's initially a requirement to be above a 52 MSA index on the grid. And then you've got above that 52 index, your different P8 fat ranges, and then of course your different carcass weight ranges and where the impact occurs. And then in this case, you can actually set penalties. So if you've been penalised on the lower end of the MSA index score, but you've actually then had a premium on the higher end of the index score, you can input this data in and then go and have a look at whether across your whole herd or across those different date ranges, how much of those cattle, how many of those cattle would have actually met the grid, and start doing some performance indicators on that, which I'll touch on now. So I'm just stepping into the compliance to grid. So we're looking at those grids before and creating those grids in the system. And then you can actually apply the data that's in the myFeedback system to that grid. So you can see the change for that, the LAE test or the more in-depth grid. You can see the change in compliance to that grid. And so that you see even about that 62 fluctuates then a low 40% compliance to the grid. So really out of spec cattle up to above an 80% compliance. Obviously, this is just an example I've put together. You would develop that in relation more directly to what your supply chain requires and working with your producers to help them set up that grid more directly to where they're consigning cattle to the different processes. And then from there, it actually gives you an understanding of the non-compliant and the compliant to that grid and whether they're over spec or whether they're under spec. And so then that helps you identify, well, where is my shortfall? So in this case, these producers, these cattle, the MSA index is fine. Ultimately, there's a small portion that is under spec, but then you've got majority are compliant to the index. However, the carcass weight spec, there's a significant portion that are overweight in this case and may not fit that spec. So you might be able to work with your producers to help them actually understand, well, if you're getting heavier carcasses, maybe there's an opportunity maybe to turn them off earlier, or let's have a look at what other grids or what other processes might be available and better separate your cattle according to where the market demand is for that type of product. So it gives you a bit of an understanding of ultimately where you're compliant, under and over spec and what those opportunities are around the product there, and a quick summary going forward. And then of course, you can actually then directly compare grids. So you can sort of look at where those grids might differ and understand where that works. And so you can see your carcasses grid spec to grid A and then the carcasses to grid B. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Obviously, there's a bit of information on this page in terms of the data there, but it's ultimately available for you to work with your producers and for your producers to identify some of that compliance to the different grids side by side. So you can see that there as well to grid A and grid B, your compliance level to those specs. Obviously, in grid B is the only grid that we've put an MSA index in because grid A was quite a basic grid. But as you build those out, you can work on that further. So that's sort of the key features of the myFeedback platform. In terms of the cattle side of things. In the sheep side, you do have other opportunities around the disease and defect, but as we go forward and working with industry on the MSA model, there'll be more data coming through that'll actually incorporate the MSA index and the carcass traits that are measured during the MSA grading going forward. But this enables you, enables your producers to access any of their sheep data as well in myFeedback. This allows us to actually then get more individual reporting and understanding on that individual group of animals and an individual animal as opposed to a mob-based outcome there. And I'll just hold 5 there. But the same sort of thing with grids, you can actually set up your own grids in relation to the grid specs that are coming through in the sheep supply chain. And that gives you an opportunity to identify where your performance is in relation to those grids in the sheep space as well. So very much similar features across beef and sheep meat, but ultimately there was more detail available in the beef because of the significant amount of carcass data coming through from the different systems available. In the sheep side of things, currently measuring these key 3 traits that are being reported and recorded going into the system. And this is part of the National Sheep Health Monitoring Program that Animal Health Australia put together. Very much similar features. You can go into the solutions to feedback to understand the impact of those disease, how to identify them, how to control them, that sort of information. And then, of course, you can see where out of that group of animals, numbers diseased versus non, and showing the impact there in terms of numbers. So from that ultimately leaves us sort of the key features of the myFeedback platform. We do have the opportunity for advisors to actually have access to multiple producers that they're working with, works under a permissions type of setting. So what the producer can do there is they can actually go in and provide access directly to you as advisors to then for you in your own login see their data, but only specific to those producers. You won't be able to go in and see all your different producers' data aggregated. You actually just see those individual producers that you might be working with that have provided you access. So what that looks like is the producer themselves. So I'm under a producer platform, of course. They go down and you can actually go into your profile and have a look at your different picks. So it's measured by pick. So if you've got multiple picks, you can add those in as well. But ultimately for the livestock advisors to get access to the producer specific data, it's ultimately just inviting a new user to that system. So if you don't already have a myFeedback login, it'll just send you an invitation to ultimately to get you to create a user. And that'll all just be through myMLA. So everything's linked together with myMLA, and that allows you to access into not only your own system if you've got your own cattle or sheep going through, but also then change into the producer that has provided you with access. And so I'm going to pull up right there and provide any opportunity for questions. Happy to go back through anything that we need to if we've got time and go from there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Will. Well, there's a lot in that platform, and I'm very much looking forward to getting in there and really having a good play with it. I think it's one of those kind of things that you just need to do a few times to really understand the value that it's going to bring to your business. I have
definitely.
While we wait, please everyone pop any questions that you have into the chat, or if you would like to come off mute and ask them as well, you have that ability. But I might just start off, Will, just by asking for the consultants that want to get access to their producers' data. Is there a specific consultant login that you need to have for that, or is it just the standard myFeedback login?
The providing access there, so the producer can send an email invitation to be able to have access as a consultant. And then that provides you with the ability to change into the specific producer's data or user, I guess is probably the best way to put it. And so if you've got 5 different producers you're working with, you can actually change your user into their system and see their data under that consultant platform.
Great. And you don't need to have a pick to be able to do that?
No, you shouldn't have to have a pick to be able to do that.
Fantastic. So you mentioned the features that we had in there around the sheep space. When do we think that we'll be seeing some MSA grading in the sheep industry?
Yeah, good question. So we're actually working very closely with industry currently. So we've done work with 80% of what represents the national slaughter within industry. So across those major processing facilities around the country, there is a level of technology that they are needing to utilise to put into the facility to actually then capture the data. So we're working through that with them and helping them understand the benefit of that data. But it's definitely on the roll. So we're working on over the next 24 months to have industry actually grading MSA sheep meat data and utilising that data for feedback as well.
Yeah, fantastic. We've got a question from Jim just asking, you might have covered this, but as an advisor, can we log in and have a look at the aggregated national/regional data?
Yeah, definitely. So pretty much all those type of features that I was going through there, you log in and have a look at that, you'll be able to access the national state the same as if the producer was accessing the national state and that sort of thing. So as you log in, you'll be able to step through that producer data in comparison to, or benchmarking to, national state. And we also do a beef eating quality insights report every 2 years, which also has aggregated data on national state as well. So we can always share that round if you want that report for the last 2 financial years.
Fantastic. I think that would be a really good thing to share. Just as if there's more questions coming in, but I will ask, you mentioned the breeder access and the feedback to breeders, which I thought was that's a really fantastic feature and something that I think that's really needed. How do they access that feedback? Is that just in their standard? So if a breeder goes into their standard login, will it just automatically be included, or do you also need to provide access to your breeder?
So the way it works is based on that original pick. So if your pick and you have a myFeedback login based on that pick as a breeder, the data associated with that pick will come in. So it's just logging in as a normal user.
Fantastic. That's great. I don't have any more questions from my end. Is there any questions for the group? You can pop your hand up or come off mute and ask. I can see Hanley's typing in the chat. So I'll give that one a minute.
Whilst you're typing that out, if you would like to touch base with us to go through it more on a one-on-one basis, or even with your own producer groups, we're more than happy to be in touch and work through that with you, because it's definitely something for us to work with the industry to help them understand the opportunities behind this. So happy for Keely to share our details, or just go through yourself, Keely.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll send through at the end of that's not Hanley. Better one-on-one. I'll send through the details for the MSA team following this webinar with the recording. So if you do have any questions, please reach out to Will and the rest of the MSA team, and they'll be more than happy to help you out with it.